Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Before we begin, we just want to let you know that we are going to be doing more live events on Zoom where we can connect together as a community. At the time of recording, our next live event is going to be on the 30th of January 2022. If you would like to join us, please check out the link in the show notes. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. As always, I'm here with Steph. Hi Steph.
Hi Sarah.
Well, I know you're not one for really looking at the analytics for the podcast, because I know it can stress you out a little bit.
It does. It does.
But I wanted to talk to you about the analytics.
Okay. What are you going to say?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank people that have already rated us wherever you listen to this podcast, because it really helps. So we really appreciate you taking the time to rate. The other thing that I think is really cool is on the podcast platform that we use, you can see where in the world people are. You can see how many downloads and how many listeners you've got in each country. The UK have been winning. We've been beating you guys over in the US. And the US, I think there's almost nothing in it now. You guys are catching us up. It's pretty much even between the two countries.
See that?
And then, well, then the next countries that come up a lot is Canada, Ireland, and Australia. I see a lot of people there. But I also think it's really cool. We've got 2 listeners in Japan. I would just say hi to you guys over there.
Oh, that is awesome.
To me, that's just, I look at these countries and like Slovenia, we've got 1 listener in Slovenia. So whoever you are, hi to you as well. We can just go to all the countries and say how many listeners we've got and say hi to you all. Wish we could, but then you might feel a bit shortchanged because you come here to hear us talk about something else.
Well, as you know, I don't like analytics. It makes me nervous and I just prefer to close my eyes and talk and not pay attention. So, I mean, no, why rate us? What does that do for our analytics?
Well, it helps people to find the podcast. It means that people can find us organically because there are so many podcasts out there that most of the time now for someone to find your podcast, they have to already know it exists.
Yeah. Like search it. So this helps. It just pushes us up so that it's more searchable. Like it's coming up more in searches of relevant concepts. So people might find us when they don't even know they're looking for us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it only takes a minute. And if we want to rescue people from the clutches of diet culture,
we need your ratings. Maybe it's worth saying how to do that. Because I know as a podcast listener previously, I was like, oh, sure, I'd gladly rate you, but where do I go?
I'm an Apple user, so I only really know Apple. But if you go into the podcast in Apple and you just start scrolling down, at the bottom, you will see an opportunity to rate. You can just leave a rating or you can write a review. Write a review if you want to, but it's totally up to you. Ratings all help.
I just, when the numbers come in and all these like logistics, I don't know why my stress response goes on.
Well, what does it mean to you? Because to me, I think it's just cool to see these people. Each one of them, each number is a person out there.
You know what?
It
sets up expectation. I think that if I know something concretely, then I expect it has, like, if it's I'm getting into it. It's like, is it good enough? Is it not good enough?
Exactly. I'm like, just give me all the analytics.
I
want to know it all.
This is why we are a good team then. You can do that. And I'll just type up the summaries of what we talked about.
Deal. The subject came off the back of an Instagram post I did. And the title of the post was, are you sometimes scared to start eating in case you can't stop? Sometimes it feels easier not to eat than to eat in quote unquote moderation. And a lot of people seem to relate to this. I'm not alone in having had this experience very strongly. So I was all about the fasting, smaller feeding windows, all of that, because I just couldn't trust myself. It felt like each time I gave myself permission, once I started, like that was it. So if I could just delay eating, it gave the illusion that there was more control. But I think it was an illusion. So the more strongly I believed that once I start, I can't stop, the more that just kept becoming reinforced. And the more I got in a fight with my appetite, and I always found the more I fought with it, the stronger and more out of control it got. So I think that was part of it. It set me up for this fight and this conflict.
For me, it was like I knew how to do all and I knew how to do nothing. But being in the gray zone for me was that intolerable feeling. And so once you start eating, it's like, I either want to not eat or I want to binge, because binging was like fun. It was me in my little cocoon. And so eating a little to me was not worth it. It was like, that's boring. And it's a teaser, in a place where I needed it to be all or nothing. And I think that was part of it. It was almost like really disappointing to start eating and to know that like I'd like just a little bit in that I'd have to stop. It was like, well, don't put me in the position of feeling like, because it's an escape for a minute, you just like go into it. And I'm sure that part of this is dopamine. And it's like, okay, well, your reward setters start to light up and then you're telling me I have to get out. It felt rude. I would rather just not start and not enter the zone of feeling comfortable. Because as uncomfortable as binging was, there's something that parallel to that feels very safe and comfortable and like I'm just shutting out the world for a minute. And so to have to toggle back and forth between reality and that safe space, I'd rather just stay. And I feel that way still in general in a lot of other areas where it's like it's very difficult to transition. I'd rather just stay where I am rather than deal with that back and forth of transitioning.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that as well. And as you were talking, what came into my mind was that part where you get beyond the point of hunger. It's like some people will talk about it as, oh, I've gone past the point of hunger. There seems to be this window, and it tends to be around 4.5 hours, 5.5 hours after you've last eaten. Your blood sugar starts to come down, and that falling blood sugar actually stimulates your appetite more than when your blood sugar just bottoms out. Because when you then hit that point, you switch from, this is my very rudimentary understanding of it, you switch from using glycogen and your body starts releasing the fat stores. And it's why most of the time when we wake up in the morning, we don't wake up feeling starving hungry, even though we might not have eaten for 12, 14 hours, whatever it might be. And so there was something about getting past that stage for me that I used to aim for. I used to strive for, because I felt like once I'd got over that ridge and I'd switched into fat burning mode. That was my understanding of it. The switch felt uncomfortable, but once that switch had gone, then I felt pretty good for a while. But that was when something psychologically would start happening. That felt physically I was more comfortable,
right?
But there was some switch in my brain that was this.
Yes.
There's something very enticing, I think, at times when you're trying to deprive yourself and you haven't been able to, and then you manage to get into some kind of restrictive flow. You can feel powerful. You can feel invincible. And to me, like the word that comes to mind when I think about that is that was just a really dangerous place for me.
Yeah.
Because actually it was disconnecting as well. Because when you're doing it, the amount of times when I thought I'd, got it figured out and looking at other people struggling and being like, look at you still struggling. I've got it all figured out now.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something very, very egocentric about it. Like it felt very egoic for me when I was in that place. And there was always a crash afterwards. Yeah. Always a fall from grace.
I think that especially when you're talking about fasting and the pursuit of that right now in this moment in time in this culture, that psychological piece is the part that's bypassed as important. It's like, well, if I could just get into the physiology of that high, then I should be good to go. And I think maybe the psychological response of that you're talking about is equated with like, well, that's just willpower then. I think there's this idea that psychology is more under our control than physiology, which sure, to a degree, it's about, let's like, okay, changing your mind. That's cognition. But because at this point in the game where I am right now, I think that a lot of my recovery maintenance is respect for that psychology and not just looking at the physiology, because I completely am like, yeah, my physiology will not tolerate caloric deficits, but neither will my psychology. And I think before I would have thought, well, I can be more powerful. I can overpower my psychology, and I should be able to. Like, that's willpower, right? But I think that I have such a strong respect for my psychology and the way that I know myself to work that I feel it almost physically. Like when I'm veering away in other areas of life, even away from what I know to be true about my psychology, I feel it, and I'm like, oh, don't try to pull one over on yourself still. Like, just respect the psychology.
Mhm. Well, I think there's a certain pride that comes for me. Anyway, if I got into that restrictive zone for normally only a relatively short period of time, there would be this pride, and I would feel proud of myself for restricting. And the problem is when I wasn't restricting, when I was binging, I was in shame and self-hatred and all of that. So to come out of that, it's like my self-esteem becomes hooked on. I can now do this. I've managed to get in this zone of restriction, but I've hooked my self-esteem onto it. Like my self-worth is now hooked onto it. So all it takes is something that causes some kind of disinhibited eating, like a party or an event or a hangover after the party, whatever it might be, something that just creates a little crack in that resolve.
Yeah.
There's a sense of losing a bit of control, and then I slip, and then I slip, and I've got nothing to hold on to because the thing I was using to make myself okay, I'm now losing. So now I'm not okay, and I'm in this free fall. And that for me was the sort of the psychological arc of it, the few times that I managed to, because people will talk about, I just need to get myself back in the zone. I've done it before. I need to get myself into that place where I can restrict, where I can control, because it's enticing when you are. But the problem is the minute you attach your self-esteem
Yeah.
to your ability to do that, that I think is when you're setting yourself up for some pretty disordered
Right.
cycles.
Right. And I think for many people who have experienced the highs of dieting and weight loss, there is a part of the ego that is attached just because. And I think we remember that. And so for me, if I were to go on a diet right now and experience some kind of high, or if my ego were to attach to that outcome at all, my brain remembers that that's ego led. And it also remembers how that ultimately felt, like that was ultimately a condition of worth. And I know that so well that I don't, the very thought of it makes me want to, no, like I don't want to go there again. I don't ever want to be in the position again where I feel like my worth and my self-esteem is attached to these conditions. It's like the analytics. I don't want to know things that I might be able to attach to. And I don't want to get sucked in. And I think a part of me knew that pre-recovery. I think that I was starting to come onto that. And so when I would start fasting, there would be part of me that recognized that I was going on that ego train. And then when I would start eating, I think that was where my psychology was like, keep going. You need to get out of this. It was like that psychological rebellion of that ego high that, in the moment was like, yeah, you're, I don't know how long you can coast here for, but as soon as you start eating, we're going to go for it because we need to get far away from this. And I think, on a physiological level, I think that's understandable how that happens. Your brain is literally like, get the food while you can, that scarcity reaction, but psychologically too, that there's a psychological scarcity reaction of you're getting too far away from yourself. Your ego is taking you too far. We need to come back. Like, you need to get centered. That was a really strong feeling I had about why when I would start eating food after a period of deprivation that I couldn't stop. I think it was my psychology's way too of protecting me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know how to pursue weight loss without it being ego led. And that's why I think that's possibly why I think I can't do it.
Yeah.
Because it wakes up. I need my ego to wake up and to be more dominant and a bigger force in order for me to be able to pursue intentional weight loss. If I thought I could genuinely pursue it from a place of self-care, like for some reason it was an act of self-care, I don't know whether that's necessarily the case for anyone, but maybe sometimes it is, then maybe that would be different. But I just
All I'm
I'm
thinking
like, I
of is
don't need to pursue that for
Yeah.
self-care. I really don't. Like, I don't.
I'm trying to think of where that would even, I'm like, well, if I had to go on like some space mission to save the earth, and like had to like lose a certain amount of weight to fit into this special spaceship, I could probably do it then.
Yeah.
But like,
Or maybe if you had to look after a horse and you had to ride it and the horse was a bit more
maybe.
fragile
Yeah, yeah.
and it could only take up
Right.
to a certain weight.
It's not
And so you're
about me at
doing
that
it
point.
out of, no, exactly. You're doing
But-
it for very altruistic reasons.
Yeah. But exactly, I think that's so relevant because weight loss typically is an ego-driven sport. You know, that's
Mhm.
what it is. And I know that there would also be for my health. You know, there's an idea of like, well, I need to lose weight for my health, and why isn't that enough? And there's a lot of guilt for people around. I still can't even manage to do it for my health. But I think we've covered that too in a different episode where there's a misconception about weight and health. I think maybe we know that too, that there are pursuits of health that can be that a weight loss is not that primary determinant of that.
Mhm. Because, well, it can be in there as well. So it can be health, and then the health stuff is also mixed in with some ego stuff and with potential pressures from beyond you. But I suppose if you're saying, I want to do this for my health, are you willing to do some shifts in your behavior that support your health that won't affect your weight yet? Because until
Right.
you can say
Right.
that, I don't think you can
Exactly.
say that it's purely driven by health.
Right.
Because you'd be willing to do the smaller health things that
Mhm.
may not affect your weight yet. So it's just complicated. I think we can
Yeah.
rarely get our motivations and intentions down to one
Yeah.
thing.
I have a client who I've been working with for just a few weeks, and she messaged me yesterday and said, because her entire journey has been like, well, I've always wanted to lose weight for my health, and that's why I do this. It's more about the nutrition and this whole thing. And she said to me yesterday, she said, I got down to the question of if I knew that the pursuit of that health would not make me lose a pound, or that I would gain weight from that, would I still do it? And the answer was no. So she was like, this was a light bulb for me, that I realized that this was a facade of the pursuit. But getting back to, you know, starting that feeling of when you start eating and you feel like you can't stop. So that rooted in things like psychology, physiology, black and white thinking, ego, and dopamine, and being inside of that reward space. How do you move through that? So if you are someone who is in that pattern of I either eat all or I eat nothing, or once I start, I can't stop, how do you navigate that once it's in place?
I used to be a breakfast person when I was growing up as a kid and a teenager. And then when I started having these struggles with food, I was thinking to myself, well, I don't want to eat breakfast at 7 a.m. or even if at all, because I'm not that hungry in the morning. So I stopped having breakfast. I used to, but people would sometimes go, I can't believe you eat like the minute you get up. I would eat within half an hour of waking up before. And that was just a pattern that I'd got into since being a kid. And I got out of that pattern when I was struggling with food, because also I just didn't want to deal with food yet. I felt like I was already anticipating a day of battling with food. So to just delay the beginning of the battle was another part of it too. So one thing that shifted for me was realizing, actually, through experimenting, that willingness to give it a go, that eating to get ahead of hunger was actually a pretty good thing for me.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, why would you eat if you're not hungry? Like, you're trying to eat in a deficit. So it just doesn't seem to make sense to eat when you're not noticing or you don't seem to be hungry. But I found that when I started doing that and really getting into a pattern with it, that was a big shift. It was getting out ahead of the hunger, I think. And I wouldn't have believed that would have had as much of an effect as it did, because I was like, why would I want to eat earlier? I'm just going to eat more during the day if I start eating at 7:30, 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I was astonished to discover that what I had so determinedly decided was true turned out not to be.
Yeah. I think that when you tip into even slight amounts of hunger, if you wait for the first hunger cue, I think the second I felt even the first knock at the door that I was hungry, well, that was all I needed for my body to believe I was in scarcity. So then eating one thing would lead to eating all the things. Whereas eating prior to that first sign of hunger the alarm bells weren't on. Like I was in sort of a safer space where I was able to have that conversation with my brain of like, oh, I don't know, the thought of stopping sooner wasn't panic inducing. It was not, I guess, I mean, I'm sure it would habitually brought up like, no, like I'd rather not, but it wasn't like, no way, like I had more flexibility of thought and I felt like I had greater influence over my own mind when I was not in a state of even slight hunger. And I think with intuitive eating, particularly, this idea of eating with hunger and fullness and the rigid pursuit of that is a way that, again, I've spoken about this. If I had known intuitive eating prior to my recovery process, I might have followed that as a rule. And I might have been like, I wait till I'm hungry. And then I would have tipped. I think that coming from a binge restrict pattern, there's something to be said of like preempting the hunger and eating on purpose before you get too hungry, or even slightly hungry for me, because that is what allowed my presence of mind to even exist during an eating window.
And I got stuck exactly there. So I was convinced that I needed to find my hunger in order to be able to feel satisfied. I really believed that it wasn't possible to feel satisfied after eating if I wasn't hungry, because my argument was, well, if you're not hungry, there's nothing to satisfy. So you're not going to be able to feel satisfied. And discovering that that wasn't actually true. And so by delaying my eating in the morning, it was actually harder to get satisfied because I needed more than my body felt comfortable taking in one go in order to try to feel satisfied. But then I'd feel guilty and a bit stressed and panicky because I feel too full. And that in itself was a trigger for then going on to binge. And because I'm trying to eat at that time as little as I can get away with, the idea of eating more than I think I'm hungry for seemed counterintuitive. But when I did it, my binging reduced. So I was eating less than when I was trying not to do that.
Yeah, I had the same experience over time. But another point to mention is that if you are coming from a place of a binge restrict cycle, that there is that honeymoon phase in the beginning of your body going after, it's the overshooting. Like the body wants to take in more food than it needs because it's so worried about a follow-up diet. So it makes sense that your body is actually doing that. And for me, I still would eat more. Once I started, it was much harder to stop, even as I implemented a lot of these strategies. But that was a physiological thing happening that, like, without the judgment, was much easier written out. And that once that piece was satisfied and my body felt more comfortable with me, that's when my body was starting to respect the boundaries of my hunger and fullness. So all of that to say that sometimes I think that your body's inclination to take in a lot of food once it knows that food is available is a physiological appropriate response to any history of restriction if that has not been addressed yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And another thing with the hunger fullness that people pursue, that way of eating, is they're trying to stop before they're full. And what that means, they're often stopping before they're satisfied. But finding those satisfaction signals, because for me, that's the bit that felt so out of whack, because I just couldn't feel satisfied by anything I was doing, or everything I ate felt wrong. Nothing felt right. The timings didn't feel right. The amounts didn't feel right. The kinds of food just didn't feel right. So every day just felt this source of stress and confusion, and I just didn't want to have to deal with it. And that seems to be the idea of not eating for periods of time, I think, was just really appealing. And I think other people can possibly relate to that too. It's really appealing to think, oh, I just don't want to think about it. I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, because there's so much. I mean, once you start eating, oh gosh, not only the decision fatigue about what to eat, but how much of it, and then the shame that will start to come in, and the thoughts we have about ourselves and what this means. And here we go again. And now I'm going to ruin my day. There's so much attached to what might happen when you start eating that it's more appealing, especially if you're not being compelled to eat right at that second. It's like, well, why am I going to go there? Like, that's just opening a can of worms. Why would I rock the boat? Not quite understanding how that was actually going to contribute to the inevitable few hours later where then I had no choice anyway. It was, you ride something out as long as you can because it just feels safer.
And one of the points I made in my post was about actually the state that I was in when I ate made all the difference. So when I ate in a stressed or confused state, I couldn't feel satisfied. I couldn't, I was too stressed out. So getting myself to a place where I could calm myself down when I ate, to pursue that, I want to say peace again. I know that you and I have talked about peace before, and it might have different connotations for both of us. But that idea of calming my body down, taking a few deep breaths, and getting myself into, I want to say, the right emotional state. And I don't mean right as in like there's a wrong one, but in a calmer, clearer state. Part of my recovery was trying to, when it came to having permission to eat foods, was to take care of the state that I was in when I was eating certain foods. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is another piece for some people that perhaps might be missing, because they might be trying to do all these things, but there's so much stress and there's so much guilt around them. So when you are choosing to eat earlier, I think there's something quite empowering about that. When that's something that you have decided to do, a bit like you with your all in and your decision not to restrict, you'd made it a very clear decision. So there might be some, for want of a better word, like overshooting or eating more at the time, but it feels like you've made that decision. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you can feel calmer and you can hear those signals a little bit better, even if you're still not great at interpreting them yet.
Yes, I think about that sometimes, because for all the talk of like reducing black and white thinking, none of that existed in the beginning. And I really did need to almost make it black and white for me to recover, because I needed it to be a decision I made all the way, with no ifs, ands, or buts about it, for it to work for me. That's how my brain needed to operate at that time. It was black and white. For me to have been a little bit in and not all in would have confused me and made me feel more nervous. And I wouldn't have had the calm of knowing this was an action that I was taking on purpose. Like the expectation of it itself was calming. And I think you're right about the state you're in when you eat, because if you are introducing stress, guilt, and shame and fear when you start eating, and then you notice that it's difficult to stop, and then that causes this elevation of emotion, your nervous system goes wacky. And then you're in that state of like, I need the food to push that down, like literally to calm me. And that need for calm, that's where food, I talk about this all the time from my OT background of sensory, like the sensory experience of food being such an effective soother, that when you're literally creating a situation where your body needs to be soothed from the stress of what you're doing right there and then, that food is going to be the natural, it's right there. I mean, you're going to just keep going for it. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. And sort of having a little bit of respect for knowing that food is a soothing agent. And the more judgments we're making as we're actively eating, the more we're going to need soothing. The more we're going to eat, the more we're going to need soothing, that's a cycle.
So with somebody who has a lot of food anxiety, who's listening to this and goes, okay, I get that idea of if I can get myself in a calmer state when I eat, that there's some potential benefit there. What are some of the ways that someone can do that when there is a lot of noise going on around food, to feel a bit calmer and grounded when they eat?
That's going to look different based on the scenario, because I think that in a perfect world, pausing, having an intentional meal, just that brief response time would be relevant. And I think intentional meals, it's part of, I think, why my own recovery process worked, because I did have very distinct meal times. They were windows, but they were honored each and every time because I needed to make them intentional, which helped alleviate the guilt, because it wasn't impulsive eating. It was like, I'm meaning to do this. I'm doing this on purpose. Therefore, I don't feel out of control. But there are also going to be times when the eating just happens impulsively. And that's when I think the food anxiety is much harder to deal with, because it's happening in the moment. There was no time to prepare, and everything's now. And finding that space of pause doesn't always feel accessible. So for me, what helped me, I've talked about this, but reducing food guilt came from literally, if I was in that situation where I was like, I'm just eating now, oh no, slowing down for the purpose of reminding myself, this is allowed. I am not ashamed of this. I'm eating slowly and I'll eat as much as I want slowly, not mindfully, but like slow it down, literally like just slowing this whole process down, helped my body feel like, oh, she's doing this on purpose. Like she's not in shame mode. She's just eating a lot. But that act itself helped me more times than I can count. I remember looking at the food, noticing that I was like shoveling it in and just reminding myself, like you don't have to feel shame about food, slow down. And just, I would slow down. And I didn't mean that I didn't stop. It's just that I slowed it down. And doing so had a natural calming effect because it's like the biofeedback of that, where your body's like, oh, if we're moving slowly, then we're not stressed, because when you're stressed, you're not moving slowly. And so that for me was really helpful.
But the bit that came before the slowing down is the bit I'm interested in. And that was the self-talk. That change there. You said to yourself, this is okay. I'm allowed to do this. Just slow it down. Like it's okay. That development of a kinder, more supportive voice in your head to counteract the more critical voice, I think is really important. And I hope things like the podcast and the work that we're doing and we're putting out there is helping people to become more accepting and to see like we're not the only ones who feel like this, who have these thoughts and feelings around food. And how do we speak to ourselves to calm ourselves down in those moments?
Yeah, because you have to believe it's true first. So all the years prior to this time in my life where I actually did move through a recovery process that quote unquote worked, I didn't slow down because I didn't believe that it wasn't shameful. Like I didn't have data. I didn't have anyone telling me that because it was not the time of social media. And so I didn't hear about it. So in my mind, I just heard diet culture and I assumed that my shame was totally like, why would I doubt that? It was relevant. Whereas the more I moved into like I had to buy into the idea that, oh, maybe food guilt isn't appropriate. Like maybe eating is okay. Maybe eating itself is a way out of binge eating. Like that concept even being there had to exist before I would give myself permission to slow down and say it was okay. Which I think is a place that differentiates recovery now from recovery ever before, because we have more people talking about this. We have podcasts talking. I mean, there's so many more people. There's so much more community there to support that idea. That it might be easier to get behind or even to be aware of in the first place. And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah. It's the community aspect, getting to work on the shame, isn't it, really?
Can I ask though, like to summarize, what would be the reasons why someone might feel like when they started eating, they can't stop? Can we what would be a list of those, and then we can move into how we would deal with that?
I think there's something about unrealistic expectations. I would often set myself these ideals in my mind about how I was going to eat that day. So there was some I've blown it thinking going on for me. And once I felt that, then it was no holds barred. And also because I'd be telling myself that tomorrow I won't eat till X time, whatever it might be, was then giving myself that window to get in as much food as I possibly can, because I know that I'm going to try and delay my eating again tomorrow. And it would often be this sort of little slippery thing where I would be trying not to eat yet. And then I might have a thought and I'd be like, oh, well, maybe I just fancy a piece of fruit. And there was no good reason not to have a piece of fruit. So I'd go and have a piece of fruit. And then I'd be like, oh, well, I've eaten something now. Maybe I'll have a bowl of porridge.
Yeah.
And I have a bowl of porridge. I've blown it.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think that's why it would feel like it, because it would feel so slippery. And I didn't even see my mind slipping down into it at the time. It wasn't always as sudden as, okay, I'm not eating. And now the minute I want to eat, I'm going to binge.
Yeah.
It would be slipperier than that. So it would feel like, tracing it back. Where was the problem? The problem was I started eating in the first place. I shouldn't do that. That was the
I'm just remembering.
That was the pattern for me. Yeah. So I think there's definitely something about expectation, and then feeling like you haven't met your expectation, and then setting a new expectation, which means now, it doesn't count because tomorrow you're gonna do real good.
Right. Which is part of the mental restriction pattern or physical.
Yeah. And there might be something from an evolutionary perspective that when we have food or when we start to eat, we should be getting in a load of food until we know when we can eat again. So there is something perhaps about when we start, we should take in a substantial, satisfying amount of food to
Yes.
keep us going to the next eating event, whereas we can actually graze all day now because we've got food around us all the time, most of us.
Yes, exacerbated by any presence of hunger or recent hunger. I think from an evolutionary standpoint, if our body has recently experienced hunger, even if it binged as well yesterday, but also was hungry all day prior to that binge, it remembers that it gets hungry and too hungry. And therefore, when food is present, let's go for it. That's the physiology that comes to be at play, but also, pointing out the psychology. Now, there's a psychology around this as well of keeping yourself safe from becoming too attached to your ego, which likely preceded this moment. I think that's an important one that I haven't heard talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another thing as well that often happens around people not allowing themselves to eat what it is they really feel like eating. That could be another part of it. You're eating the breakfast or the lunch or whatever that you think you should. But because it wasn't what you really wanted, you're not satisfied. So then you go on and you have something else, which still isn't quite what you wanted, but you feel like it, and you keep going. There's often those posts on Instagram and it's like, you want a cookie, so you eat this, and everything else and like 10 cookies. And now you've binged compared to you want a cookie, you eat a cookie and life goes on.
Yeah, except that is how it is now. But I would always look at posts like that and say, like, no, if I started with a cookie, I would just keep going with everything else anyway. Like that wouldn't have done it. I would just want to give a shout out to anyone who's thinking that because I know that I used to be like, no, really, if I'd satisfied the initial craving, I wouldn't have just walked away. But there's something to be said of that later in the process, definitely. And I think another point of this is, that food is pleasurable and it's an experience of what feels like escape or safety or happiness or pleasure. And where that exists, it's difficult to pull out. That's just a place where, yeah, you don't want to stop because it's your access in and it feels like a teaser. I think that's another piece of it as well. That's also rooted in your brain. Like that's the way we're built. Food is pleasurable.
Gosh, this stuff's so jolly complicated, isn't it? It's going to keep us going for years.
Yeah. Well, good.
Any final thoughts that you want to leave people with who might be struggling or holding this belief and finding that it's holding them back in their recovery?
Again, this is one of those things that feels like the problem to solve. And I think it's more about looking at things that surround it, like not necessarily setting up an expectation that you're going to be able to start eating and stop when you're full. And that this is actually a cumulative effect of the way we talk to ourselves, the way that we think about food, the way we're addressing our guilt around food, our pleasure access in general, and our physiology and psychology, and that these are all areas that will ultimately help this phenomenon change and shift rather than just assuming that there's some like willpower way to stop doing it.
Yeah. And I would probably want to emphasize that point around the problem with continuing down this path and this belief is that you stay in that fight with your appetite. You stay in that place of, I cannot be trusted. And actually, we want to find a way to build that trust with you and your body, with you and your appetite. And that comes, I think, through accepting the appetite, because we want to deny it and we don't really want to have it, and we feel quite pleased if our appetite diminishes for a while, and we feel proud of ourselves if we feel like we conquer it. The point I made earlier about getting out ahead of the hunger, that is just the opposite of everything diet culture tells you to do about it. And I think there's something incredibly empowering about that, to say, no, I am going to feed and nourish and fuel my body because I know that's what it's going to need today. I don't have to wait until it starts trying to get my attention, because that's the point where it starts to be harder to honor it in a way that feels balanced and regulated.
I just want to say as a quick ending, like we moved recently and my kids' bus stop time changed. So it's earlier. So it kind of just changed the way my whole morning looks. And so for the first month that we lived here, I was like having breakfast after they left instead of before they left, just because it was harder to get them out the door.
Mhm.
And by the time I had breakfast after they left, my hunger had already started to kick in, and my eating was much less calm. Then now I've switched it, and I have it before they leave, which is before I'm hungry. But I am so much more calm when I eat. It's a completely different experience, and that still exists, like where my body still, when it perceives that there's a hunger, that's like, we're getting hungry, too hungry. Like it changes the energy of you as you eat. And so that remains. And it was just an example, as you were talking, I remembered, yeah, that's actually still true. Yeah, that eating prior to the hunger is actually can be so much more helpful. It just makes my day go so much smoother not to start out with that, like, oh no, I'm really hungry now,
Yeah, lovely example. Okay, so is it you ending it? You ending it? I mean no, I won't go there. That's a bit dark. The podcast.
If you want to reach us, you can find us at lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com, or you can send us a message on Instagram at lifeafterdietspodcast. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, Sarah. Next week. Bye.